Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. I stopped Edward not far into the line of trees behind Charlie's house. I'm sure the mischief I was feeling was reflected on my face. I was worried about the meeting later that night. So I was looking for a distraction. Edward was looking at me curiously, but I just smiled at him for a long moment before I said anything. Edward, Alice said something once that made me quite curious. I began, my lips curving upward in a teasing smile. What was that, Bella? He was always so desperately polite with everyone, but he had a look in his eye, warm and affectionate, that I had only noticed when he was looking at me. I liked that. Just how fast are you? At that moment, he realized what I was up to, and the smile on his face grew until it reflected in his eyes and radiated back at me. Why don't we see, he suggested in a soft, low tone that made me want to grab him and kiss him. He took a step back and bowed toward me formally. Ladies first. I needed no more prompting, figuring that I would need any advantage that I could get, and I took off into the trees like a bullet. He gave me only a second before he followed me. He was right on my heels. I was running for all that I was worth. What little I had seen of his family told me that Alice wasn't often wrong. And she had already told me that Edward was desperately fast. For a moment, I pondered trying to trip him, but gave up on that idea. I wasn't a cheater, and besides, I really did want to know just how fast he was. He might win this race, but he was going to have to work for it. He let me lead for the most part, running next to me in a nearly leisurely manner. It was obvious, however, that he was enjoying himself. He was so radiantly happy, the smile on his lips nearly took over his entire face. After quite some time running, it became obvious that he was humoring me. Both of us could run for days, but he was keeping a perfect pace with me. I tried to put on more speed, but he easily kept up. I shot him a suspicious look and shook my head. You're just playing with me, I accused. I tried to make it sound harsh, but I was laughing too much inside to hide it in my voice. He just grinned back in response. Well then, let's see who can make it to your meadow first. We need a finish line, don't we? He might have never wanted to stop running, but running did get boring after a while. I wanted a goal. Some end in sight. Should we make a bet? That seems to be a tradition in your family. What should we bet? He responded quickly, his smile turning mischievous. I have no idea. What would you suggest? I wasn't a gambling girl. It seemed like his brothers bet on everything, so I was more than willing to take his suggestions. How about if I win, you challenge Emmett to arm wrestling? His grin grew wider. I was immediately suspicious. Why? I'd like to see the look on his face when he loses. Edward was trying to look innocent, but this time he couldn't pull it off. I accept, but if I win, I get another kiss. He'd last kissed me in the car while skipping biology, and I wanted more. He nodded, accepting my terms, and we spun around to head the other direction. His grin widened and he shot forward, proving what I had already figured out. He was faster than I was, and he'd totally been messing with me. I heard his laughter echo through the trees, and I smiled. I didn't think he had been a very happy person before I came to Forks, but if that was the case, he was changing. The Edward DeForest knew was quick to smile, shared his laughter openly, and often made me laugh. He was waiting for me when I made it to the meadow, and I laughed at the satisfied look on his face. I slid to a stop, shaking my head at him. You are so much faster than I am. I thought you said that newborns filled with human blood are stronger and faster and therefore better at raw physical things than older vampires. I tried to sound accusing again, but I was smiling at him too widely. Usually, that is the case. He grinned back at me, but I seemed to be quite fast. He was trying to be modest, but failing miserably. He beat me fair and square, and he knew it. So I have to make Emmett arm wrestle with me. I've never actually done that before. I was a bit worried. Emmett was the strongest of all of them, and newborn strength cannot be everything, or Edward wouldn't have just beaten me at our race. Absolutely. He was still grinning wicked. I laughed at the pleasure and satisfaction in his eyes and shook my head at him. You're incorrigible. It's about 10:45. When do you want to start for the meeting place? He looked into my eyes, smiling down at me, and then walked over and wrapped my hand in his. He lifted our entwined hands and ran the back of his fingers over the ridge of my cheekbone. My lips parted and his touch zinged through me, leaving me gasping. Edward was an addiction I didn't want to fight. Now, perhaps, isn't the time for declarations, Bella, but I do want you to know that the time I spend with you is not to keep you out of trouble. It hasn't been almost from the beginning, he said softly, shaping his palm around my cheek. He was deliberately ignoring my question, but I didn't mind so much. I cleared my throat, unsure of how to respond. I knew he wasn't unaffected by me. We had been getting a lot closer in the time we'd spent together. I just had such a hard time believing that the incredible pull I felt could be just as strong on his end as it was on mine. You are so much to me, Bella Swan. He smiled at my reaction, but continued softly. You are everything. Be careful tonight. You take everything that is important to me with you to that meeting. His hand released mine and rose to palm my other cheek, holding my face between his hands with care as though I were as delicate as a human. Slowly, his face lowered toward mine. It looked like I was going to get my kiss anyway. I could live with that. But now it was not fear that was in his eyes as his head lowered and his lips met mine. It was something so much more pleasant than fear. I hope that I read the look in his eyes right. To anyone on the outside, our kiss might have looked like cold stone meeting cold stone. His lips didn't feel like stone to me. They shaped around my own lips, warm and enticing. His breath mixed with mine. His addictive breath smelled so good to me, that cinnamon and clove scent that was uniquely Edward. I couldn't control how he affected me. At the touch of his lips on mine, I was lost. My arms swung around his neck with vampire speed, and I moved so fast that I was instantly chest to chest with him. Immediately, I wanted more. He tasted so good. His lips parted beneath mine, though neither of us pushed for the deeper kiss that would be so easy to rush into. I only cared that he was kissing me again. I wanted his lips pressed to mine, his body so close that I didn't care about anything else. It was only a moment before he was pulling away again, his head rising away from mine. I tried to follow him, unwilling to lose that touch even for a moment, and he distracted me with a laugh. Ah, Bella. As a newborn, you feel so much, so deeply. His fingers caressed my cheeks again. Do that again. I stood on my tiptoes to try and steal another kiss. He was so much taller than I was. In fact, if he wasn't seated, I couldn't reach his lips with mine without his help. I would say you have horrible timing. But the timing was all mine, and I did do it on purpose. He smiled down at me, satisfaction written upon his features. I blinked, unsure of what he meant. I'm sure my confusion showed on my face, because he laughed again. You tend to get carried away, and we cannot forget about the time right now, he explained, and then took a step back, reaching up to untangle my arms from around his neck. Now, that's just mean, Edward. My eyes narrowed at him. Bella, he breathed against my ear. His voice was so soft, caressing over me in a way that caused me to shiver. We will talk about this later, and I'll explain why. Right now, we have to head toward the clearing, if we want to be on time for the meeting. I glared at him, knowing he was right, but that still didn't mean I wasn't irritated at him. Freaky, conniving vampire doesn't kiss me enough. I wasn't sure what he was up to, but I didn't like the feeling that he was using my own newborn nature against me. The entire family was waiting for us in the clearing when we arrived. Edward explained to me that on stormy nights, he and his family often came out here to play baseball and sometimes football, Emmett's favorite sport. That made me laugh. I could imagine that vampire sports were something to see. Alice looked disturbed, pacing back and forth. I figured she was upset about not seeing this whole thing ahead of time. Jasper watched me as though I was going to level a small town, and he wanted fair warning so he could make sure Alice wasn't in the line of destruction. Emmett was shadowboxing, darting about Rosio like he was hoping someone would start a fight so he could get in on the action. Rosie stood quietly, mostly ignoring Emmett's enthusiasm, a bored expression on her face as she inspected the state of her manicure. Esme and Carlisle stood together near where we emerged from the trees, their hands laced together and so much apart of each other that it looked wrong when they were separated. Bella Carlisle looked up as we approached, greeting me with a nod of his head. Edward, he acknowledged with a smile the man he saw as his son, and I nodded back to him as we neared. Esme didn't bother with formalities. She grabbed me into a hug as soon as we stopped walking. I laughed and hugged her back. Esme was darling, and I had no idea how anyone didn't love her. Edward, tell me what Billy said. Carlisle turned to look at Edward, and I knew he wasn't just asking about the words that came out of his mouth, but also about his thoughts at the time. He noticed right away that Bella was a vampire. It shocked him, frightened him a little. Mainly, he was worried about Charlie. Edward focused his explanation on Carlisle, though all but Rosie stepped in closer to be a part of the discussion. She remained where she was, testing the edge of her nail polish as though it might dare to peel. Esme stood beside me, her arm around my waist. I suddenly realized that she was being supportive, and it made me smile. He confronted her about it, Edward continued, glancing around at his family. She tried to put him off, but he didn't fall for it. That's when he requested the meeting. His son was with him, and Billy didn't want him to know. And he requested me specifically, Carlisle wondered, probably knowing how difficult it was for Edward to send me into an unknown situation without him. Edward and I hadn't talked about whether he'd told his family how our relationship was developing, but I figured they knew. I knew Edward saw Carlisle as more than a father figure. Carlisle was someone Edward trusted, absolutely. A true confidant and someone Edward admired to the point of hero worship. But even if he hadn't talked to Carlisle about how close we were getting, I figured there was no way we were hiding any of it from Alice. And what Alice knew, Jasper knew, and if Jasper knew, Emmett probably knew. And what Emmett knew, even the trees knew. From what I knew of him, I didn't think the guy couldn't keep a secret to save his life. He did, Edward confirmed, interrupting my musings. He asked for the leader of our family. With that wording, Edward could easily pretend to be the leader, and thus connive to stay with me, but he respected Carlisle too much for that. Carlisle was the undisputed leader of their family. He was the standard they all looked to, the backbone and strength of their shared life. They stayed together for him because they respected him. They wanted to live their lives according to the example he set. To me, Esme was the heart, but Carlisle was the soul of the family. Carlisle stood before us silent for long moments while he considered the possibilities of all this, and then he focused on Edward again. He's guessing that Bella was changed during the time she was missing this fall, but he doesn't know if we were a part of it. Edward answered what must have been Carlisle's unspoken question. If we changed her, they'll consider the treaty broken. That won't be an issue, as we had nothing to do with it. I suppose this is to ease his mind, which we can easily do. Carlisle looked over at me at this point, and his gaze considered me for a moment. He could make life with your father very difficult, Bella, no matter the results of the treaty. He may not consider it safe for you to stay with Charlie. I'm not leaving Charlie, I stated with absolute conviction, ready to stare Carlisle down if I had to. Carlisle laughed at my fervent insistence. Well, let's not borrow trouble. We'll go meet with him and see what needs to happen from there. Carlisle reached out to pat Edward on the shoulder in an understanding gesture, and then the group broke apart across the clearing. Emmett and Jasper squared off across the clearing, starting a wrestling contest that ended up with Jasper winning a bit more than he was losing. I smiled at Esme as I separated from her and walked over to sit on a large rock near the end of the clearing. Edward followed, standing near the boulder beside me. He leaned down to kiss me on the cheek and then turned to watch his brothers. Do you mind if I... He trailed off, but his eyes focused on the wrestling at the other end of the clearing. I laughed and waved my hands toward the boys. Go and play, we have some time before we have to go, and you can all get out some aggression. He grinned at me and took off in a run toward the other end, joining them quickly. There was no denying it, Edward was fast. Quite fast. As he joined his brothers, the rest of the family gathered near the trees, discussing something quietly. From what I could hear, they were talking about Alice's blackout in her visions. She was quite concerned about the blank spots, and they were trying to figure out what it meant. After a few moments, Emmett and Edward squared off, and I looked up to see Edward evade his bigger brother again and again. I laughed at the irritation on Emmett's face and shook my head as he insisted that Edward stop reading his mind because it was cheating. Jasper had left their group, and as I looked for him, I noticed that he had come across the clearing and was making his way over to me. He had never sought me out before, and I was curious about what he wanted, so I sat patiently waiting for him. It only took a moment for him to join me, and he gestured to the space on the rock beside me. Do you mind if I join you? Jasper asked in his soft, southern-accented voice. No, there's plenty of room here, I said, as I shifted over slightly to make sure that there was space to be comfortable. I heard about what happened at school the other day, he said as he hopped up to settle beside me on the rock. For a moment I wondered what he meant, and then comprehension hit. He was talking about the incident with Mike, the time where I lost control like he expected that I would. I guess there are no secrets in the Cullen family, are there? I said quietly, turning away from him to glance back at Edward and Emmett again. I noticed Edward glance our way, but it looked he was going to give Jasper a chance to talk to me. No, not really. Between Edward, Alice, and me, there isn't any point hiding anything, he said with a wry note entering his genial tone. I wanted to tell you that you shouldn't feel so bad about it. I glanced over at him in surprise, and he laughed at the look on my face. No, really, I fight harder than you every day for the control not to kill people at that school. It's harder for me than it is the others, you know, he explained. I glanced toward Edward and then back at Jasper. No, I didn't know. I thought I was the only one that had such a hard time with it. Jasper gave me a little smile, and then turned to watch the wrestling while we spoke. Yes, I have quite a difficult time with our diet. I have the most accidents of all of us, as well. You are extraordinary, you know. I don't know if Edward has told you anything about me. He turned to look at me again as he asked the question. I shook my head in the negative. Edward hadn't gone into details about Jasper's past, like he had his own. He'd given me an overview, but I hadn't thought to ask for more, as learning about Edward had been more important to me. Ah, Jasper noted quietly as he looked back again at the wrestling. There isn't much time to tell you everything now, but I wasn't brought into this life in the gentle way that most of our family had been. I was made to fight in wars against other vampires, battling over the herd lands in the south. I winced at the description of people being a herd, but I noticed how this explained the reason he was so scarred. Yes, not even close to the life we live now. I was changed during the Civil War, and so I lived much longer seeing people as a food source. I had thought that was the reason that it is so hard for me to abstain. But you challenge all my beliefs, all of the reasons I give myself for why I have such a hard time living this life as a vegetarian. Jasper was watching the boys as he said all this, and I wondered if this was hard for him to reveal. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I shook my head just slightly. You cannot hold yourself to what I do or do not do, Jasper. It is very difficult sometimes, and it's amazing that I have not had more slip-ups. Jasper laughed at my statement and then shook his head in surprise at me. Which is my point. You hold yourself to a higher standard than I do myself, and I find that I am not comfortable with that. If you as a newborn can restrain yourself, then it is my own strength lacking if I find it difficult. I just shook my head at him again. That is like comparing apples and oranges, Jasper. I am not you, and you are not me. He gave me a long look, then gestured out at the boys as Edward danced away from Emmett again, and twisted so that Emmett landed on the ground. You should learn, you know, Jasper said, watching Edward and Emmett after a long, quiet moment. Learn what? I glanced at him, a bit baffled. We were talking about having the control to resist killing people, and suddenly I should learn something. To fight, you still do not know who made you. The vampire community is not large enough that you can expect to go your entire life without ever seeing him again. His softly spoken southern accent sounded so reasonable. If you ran into them again, who is to say he would not want to finish the job? What? You're saying he might try to kill me again? I had originally believed the Cullens were going to do that, but in the time I had known them, I had let down my guard. I'd forgotten that this life wasn't an easy one with others of our kind. It's possible, or it could be someone else. It would not hurt you to know how to defend yourself. I noticed Edward glance over at us again, and then before Emmett barreled toward him in a sudden attack, and he was distracted from me once again. Edward will never suggest this to you because he is determined that you should never be put in a position where you would have to fight to defend yourself. But he cannot always control that. I glanced over where Emmett had finally surprised Edward enough that Edward hit the ground, and I winced. I thought about Jasper's words for a long moment. I wasn't the clumsy, out-of-control klutz that I had been as a human. It was likely that I could learn the things Jasper suggested without being totally useless at them. Was it worth it to me to do so? To be able to hold my own if I had to? It only took a moment, and I turned my head to look into Jasper's expectant face. I'll do it. What do I need to know? I told him with absolute surety. I was never going to be so easy to defeat again. I did not have to be a victim. I was a vampire now. Jasper chuckled. I figured that not only did the look on my face show exactly what I was thinking, he also probably felt my resolve. Not tonight, I think, but very soon. It is nearly time for your meeting with the tribal council. Good luck. We'll be close by if you need us, he said as he reached over to pat me on the shoulder, and then dropped off the boulder as Carlisle, Edward, Emmett, and Alice walked over to join us. Esme and Rosia were standing by the edge of the forest. Esme waved at me before the two turned and disappeared into the trees. I thought they were probably heading back to the house. There was no sense hanging out here. We had a large enough group that I didn't think there would be any problems that we could not handle. Edward walked right over to me and took my hand, drawing me gently down from the boulder and to my feet. Are you ready, Bella? I smiled at him and nodded, glancing around at the others. Is it far? No, it's not far. Carlisle nodded to Edward, and he took my elbow in a courtly gesture, guiding me toward what I guessed was the boundary line. "Come, Bella, let's not keep your father's friend waiting." We took off running, and I noticed that Alice and the boys kept pace with us for quite some time. Suddenly, they dropped back, and I glanced at Edward before continuing on with Carlisle. I tried not to worry about Billy. He knew that if anything happened to me, it would destroy Charlie. It only took a little while longer, and we were coming out of the forest into a small clearing. There was no visible line that I could discern, but I noticed something that smelled strange. It became stronger the farther we walked through the clearing. As he caught the scent, Carlisle seemed startled and drew me to a stop, leaning over to whisper in my ear. That makes things quite different. "If anything happens, Bella, you turn and run back to Esme as quickly as you can. Not Edward, he'll want to know you're safe. To Esme, Bella, promise me that." Carlisle's voice was almost too soft for me to hear, and his words were spoken so quickly they were almost a single slur. At my nod, he stepped away from me again, placing himself in front of me as though shielding me, and stood waiting. It wasn't long before there was movement behind the trees, and a large man, clearly Quilip like Billy, walked out of the trees. He was carrying Billy in his arms. They stopped several feet from Carlisle and looked at each other. Billy nodded to me in greeting, and then his attention fell back to the man in front of me. I heard something unusual, and my attention was drawn back into the trees. Eyes. I could see several sets of eyes. They were set wrong for humans, to the side of the head, like animals, and I blinked, startled. The movement continued, and I saw fur, limbs, and a muzzle here and there. 3 extremely large wolves appeared from under the trees, and they lined up behind Billy and his companion in a protective phalanx. There was intelligence in their eyes and purpose to their movements and position. I sniffed experimentally. The musk I took in burned all the way through my nose. The same scent that came from the wolves rose off the man carrying Billy. I looked from the younger man before us to the wolves spread out behind them and then back. I'd been a vampire long enough that I knew something about how people smelled. No one had ever smelled like this before. I expected that the wolves wouldn't smell human, but neither did the man carrying Billy. My mind wanted to reject my instant assumption that because they smelled the same, they were the same. I knew I couldn't do that. However, I was a mythological creature. Why should I assume? They were not either. We weren't dealing with a group of touchy tribal elders. We were dealing with a pack of wolves, likely werewolves, led by a group of touchy tribal elders. Suddenly, I understood Carlisle's warning. This situation could be a great deal more dangerous than we had assumed earlier. I heard a hiss behind me, way off in the trees. It sounded like Edward. He knew what we faced now, and he was upset. Probably because I was facing them without him. "Bella," Billy started, his eyes on Carlisle. "I'm glad that you were able to meet tonight and to bring your friend." There was a slight pause before the word friend, as though Billy wasn't sure that the Cullens were capable of friendships. "It didn't seem unreasonable, Billy," I said quietly, and it could easily be inferred that it might seem unreasonable now. "This shouldn't take long, really. We just want to check and be sure that the treaty between the tribe and the Cullens is still intact." Billy glanced back at me as he spoke, but his attention was still on Carlisle. The man holding Billy in his arms stiffened at his words, and there was a growl from behind them. The man carrying Billy rumbled under his breath, and that put a stop to the noise. I glanced at him again. This wasn't just an underling who was here just to cart Billy around. This man held some rank in the pack. "The treaty is intact, Billy," Carlisle confirmed in his soft, reasonable tone. "Bella was as she is now when she arrived in Forks just this few months past. We met her after her arrival in Forks." "You didn't know her before then?" the man holding Billy asked pointedly. "We did not," Carlisle confirmed, his eyes moving from Billy to the other man. Samueli, Billy gestured to the man holding him. "He's the pack leader." It was inferred, in my mind at least, that Sam would be making the final determination whether we were all going to continue to live in peace. "Really?" Sam pushed. He didn't believe Carlisle. It was more than obvious. "I was attacked in Phoenix," I stepped forward, still staying behind Carlisle, by a man I've never seen before or since. He was blonde, taller than Carlisle, and had a red-haired woman with him. I think they thought I was going to die. They probably think I did die. My eyes were on Sam, and I met his gaze directly, letting him look into my crimson eyes. I gave him the stare down that I'd expected to give Carlisle earlier. The silent stare-down was broken by a snuffling growl from behind Sam, as though someone in his pack didn't like how I looked at him, and Sam finally relaxed slightly. "When you went missing," Billy didn't sound as though he really needed an answer to that, but I nodded anyway. "Bella, we don't know a lot about bloodsuckers," Billy started, the last word coming out with more heat than the rest. "But according to our stories, it takes some years for vampires to move among the human population." "Your stories are right," Carlisle interjected, and I was more than happy to stay out of this explanation. "For some, it can take up to 10 years to be able to be near humans without attacking them, but Bella seems to be an exception to that." Sam's eyes returned to me again, as though assessing me for the threat that I could be. "So how does she do it?" "She lives with her father. How is she not a threat to Charlie?" Sam's words were demanding and threatening. The pack would not take it lightly were I to attack my own father. "He is actually the reason that she is able to do it," Carlisle continued, as though he were teaching med students how to change a bedpan. His tone was so academic and matter-of-fact. It was her love for him and her mother that gave her the will that she needed to come back to her human life and pick up where she left off. To give them a happy ending when there could not be one for her. I felt the urge to stick my tongue out at Sam, though I decided that might be a bad idea. The wolves were already on edge as it was, and I had to admit they made me very uncomfortable. They also smelled terrible, and it grew worse, the longer I stood there. There was something about their scent that burned my nose from the tip all the way into my olfactory glands. I rubbed my nose on my arm to try and dislodge the burn. "So instead of attacking her family, she murders other people to feed her thirst," Sam demanded, leaning forward slightly. I jumped in surprise and anger and hissed at him. It slipped out. I couldn't control it. Carlisle reached back to steady me with a hand on my arm. "Quite the opposite," Carlisle continued in that same teacher-like tone. "Bella has never taken a human life on her own. She found her way to live the way that we do, subsisting only on the blood of animals." That startled the pack so much that one of the wolves in the back actually dropped down onto his haunches, blinking at me in surprise. "Not once?" Sam demanded, looking at me again and then back at Carlisle. I knew that it was unbelievable, but it was certainly possible. Carlisle had done it. Why was everyone so surprised that I could not? Well, since we were not with her when she was changed, I cannot confirm it absolutely, but I have no reason to disbelieve her. She has memories of her hunts after the change, and as you have seen, Billy, her incredible control speaks for itself. Carlisle was reasonable, but there was no question he was defending me. She has lived with humans for several months now, with her mother and stepfather, and then here with Charlie after her move to Forks. Billy nodded. "She acts normal with Charlie, even eating when he eats," Billy confirmed to Sam. "I didn't think vampires could eat human food." "It is quite uncomfortable," Carlisle confirmed, "and must be expelled later. She is determined, though, that Charlie not know that he is kept safe. He must believe that everything is as it should be, as it would have been before she was attacked." Suddenly, everyone was looking at me again, and I sighed. I really hated that all of this was because of me. I crossed my arms over my chest and let my hair drop down to cover my face. I just wanted this to be over. "The treaty is intact, then," Sam said after a long moment of silence, and there was a growl of discontent from behind him as though one of the wolves was hoping it wasn't and the war could begin. "We have concerns over so new a vampire living among humans, though. Charlie isn't entirely safe from her." I tried not to be offended at his statement, and I could feel the urge to violence rise in me again. I placed a hand on Carlisle's back, wishing it were Edward with me, but looking for strength just the same. He felt strong and sure under my hand, and I pushed away what I was feeling. If someone attacked here, it would not be me. "We were quite concerned too when we found her," Carlisle confirmed. "They had a point, and we all knew it. One of my children, Alice, sees visions of the future, and her assessment is that Bella is strong enough to succeed. The demands of her thirst decrease daily, and she hunts often to decrease the risk." His tone was so smooth and comforting. "One of my children is nearly always with her, ready to step in should something happen to cause a loss of control." Sam nodded at that. They seemed glad that someone was taking responsibility for me and going to some work to make sure that no one got hurt. "We would wish that the risk were eliminated altogether, but we all know what Charlie was like when she was missing," Sam said softly, looking down at Billy. "It would have been very hard for him if you had died, Bella." I could only nod at him. I knew it was why I had returned. I couldn't do that to them if there was a way to fix things. I directed my comment towards Sam. "I love my parents, but I won't be able to stay forever. They'll notice I'm not aging. I can finish high school and go away to college, but there is only so much that I can do to hide it. But even if I go away and don't remain in contact with them, it's better than disappearing, perhaps dead, while I was still in high school. My eyes begged Sam for compassion. They had to let me stay here to keep my parents happy for just a few more years. They had to see none of this was about me. Sam returned my look and then nodded, accepting my silent request before his attention returned to Carlisle. "Your family takes responsibility for her," he demanded. "We already have, from the first moment we were aware she had need." Carlisle quietly confirmed. "Then we will leave this as it is." Sam's eyes returned to me. "There can be no mistakes with human lives." "You don't have to tell me that," I thrust in before Carlisle could answer. I had done all of this on my own. He had no right to insult me. Carlisle reached behind him to soothe me with a touch once more. "Bella, you have done remarkably well on your own. We all know that. No one expects anything to happen. We just want to do our best to make sure that nothing does." Carlisle believed absolutely what he was saying. But I could tell that Sam and Billy didn't exactly agree. They didn't correct him, though, and for that, I was grateful. But there was no doubt in my mind that they were expecting something to happen. In their minds, it was only a matter of time before I slipped up and someone died. After the complete support of Edward and his family, I wasn't counting Rosioli's vocal opinion. This sudden assurance that a mistake was only a matter of time stung. Their lack of faith hurt, even if it made sense. I leaned against Carlisle's back, letting my forehead rest against his shoulder, and I just waited for this horrible interview to be over. I was done. My part in this was concluded as far as I was concerned. I continued to be silent as they said their goodbyes, and Carlisle waited for the wolves to fade completely into the forest and on their way back to the reservation before he gently turned me back toward his house. He pressed gently on my shoulder to nudge me forward and then led me back into the trees, breaking into a run as I did. We were headed back to safe space. After a short sprint, Alice and the boys joined us again, and we all started toward the Cullens' huge house. It was still too much for me to absorb. I didn't say anything as we ran. Edward stepped into place beside me the moment he joined us. I wanted to be as far away from the wolves as I could get, but more than that, I really just wanted Edward to take me into his arms and hold me. I felt the expectations of Edward and his family constantly, wanting to be sure of my ability to restrain my thirst. I didn't want to disappoint them, but now I was sure I'd have the wolves hounding my every step. They expected me to slip and kill someone. Not only would it break the treaty that the Cullens had so carefully cultivated, but the wolves were sure to refuse me access to Charlie if everything didn't go exactly right. As hard as I'd worked, I could still lose my family and everything I had worked for with a single moment of weakness. It was several minutes before we made it back to the Cullens' house. The lights were on and welcoming as we ran across the back lawn and through the back door. Esme was waiting for us in the kitchen, though no one spoke until we filed into the living room. Everyone returned to the places they'd been during my first visit to this house, and I wondered if these were their habitual places or if this had started after my arrival. Rosioli sauntered down the stairs and joined Emmett on the love seat, letting him pull her into his lap. Edward sat on the end of the sofa opposite Carlisle and Esme's spot and tugged on my hand. He wasn't going to let me sit on the couch between him and Esme, so he tugged on my hand until I settled onto his lap. I let him direct me this time, curling up into his arms. I wanted to be held because I was feeling so overwhelmed and depressed. Edward didn't ask me any questions, didn't press me to explain why I was so upset, just held on to me as though he knew I wasn't ready to talk about anything yet. I was sure he already knew everything that had happened, not only what had been said, but also what everyone but me had been thinking as well. I knew he had intended to be close enough so that he could see into their minds during the discussion. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the rundown, but I also didn't want to be kept in the dark about what had happened outside of what could be witnessed directly. I had been there, but there were nuances that I'd missed, thoughts and emotions that only Jasper and Edward were privy to. Only one thing made this acceptable. Just like the first day when they met me, the Cullens were having a family meeting, but this time I wasn't on the outside. I was a part of their gathering and not part of the problem they were trying to solve. I remembered the time Alice had intercepted Edward on his way to meet me after class. She told me then that I was a member of the family and that she considered me a Cullen now, in spirit if not in name. I looked up at her as I remembered the conversation and found her looking at me. She smiled and I laughed at her audaciousness. She was still trying to tempt Jasper into sitting with her on the love seat, but even after our discussion earlier, he still seemed wary of me. I was sure that he was quite concerned that I would be a danger to Alice, and was always ready to protect her. He was likely concerned about my current emotional state. Between the constant mood swings I had already been experiencing and the meeting with the wolves, I wasn't feeling so hot right now, so I couldn't really blame him. Edward noticed the look Alice and I exchanged, and he tugged on my hand questioningly. I shook my head in response. I didn't know what he was picking up from her mind, but this silent understanding seemed to me like it was a moment shared between sisters. I decided right then, if it were Alice, I'd like having a sister. Carlisle had placed himself on the other end of the couch from Edward and me, Esme, in the middle between us. Her hand was curled in his, and I noticed they were often like this, some part of them touching, even if in such a small way. The treaty is considered to still be intact, Carlisle began, confirming for the others that we weren't about to fight a war with the werewolves. But more importantly, I think, is the return of the werewolves. Everyone but Edward and me reacted in surprise, even Alice. Werewolves? Jasper must have been quite surprised. His southern accent was especially thick. They were here the first time when we were here in Hokkien. We'd thought the gene had faded into a latency ability. Carlisle explained, some of the Quiliates of specific bloodlines are able to shapeshift into wolves. Really insanely huge wolves, I exclaimed, sort of surprised that they weren't expecting this when they'd obviously encountered them before. How big are they? Alice threw out as Jasper walked around to dislodge her from the love seat. He sat down and pulled her into his lap. I was apparently less dangerous than the idea of werewolves. Alice seemed much happier with this arrangement, snuggling into his lap happily. They are quite large, Carlisle confirmed. As big as horses. They range from about 5 feet to over 7 feet. There are 4 of them, including their alpha, who met us in human form. 4? For now, corrected Edward. They're watching several of the young men in La Push. A few of them have the right bloodlines and could start shifting at any time. He glanced over at me. Jacob Black is one of them that they're paying particular attention to. I shrugged. Jacob was a friend. Kind of pleasant to be around. But vampire or werewolf, we were all supernatural creatures, and I was growing remarkably insensitive to it all. Other than the smell, I didn't see the big deal. They're willing to let things lie for now, Carlisle continued, but they are quite concerned about Charlie and the rest of Forks. They're expecting me to go on a rampage and slaughter the town, I admitted dryly. My voice muffled because I was pressing my face into Edward's shirt again. That shouldn't surprise you, Bella. Jasper's voice was soft and surprisingly gentle. You really do have extraordinary control. It's hard to get used to. I looked up and met his eyes as a feeling of quiet peace settled over me, and I smiled at him in thanks. Jasper was quite good at emotional manipulation, and he was trying to help me calm down. I haven't done anything to make anyone doubt me, I insisted, and then stopped myself. Oh wait, there was the one incident with Mike, I guess. But even still, if I haven't attacked Charlie by now, I'm not going to. On that, the full force of my complete stubbornness was lodged. If there were one person entirely safe from the ravages of my thirst, it was Charlie. They see themselves as protectors of human life and view it as their job to be worried that you might... Bella. Carlisle reminded me gently. I knew I was being the irrational one here, but I found it impossible to accept that they were so willing to write me off. Billy had known me from the time I was a baby, mostly only a few weeks every year in the summer. Therefore, it hurt that he was so sure I was a rampaging monster of death, even though I hadn't killed anyone. Another feeling of quiet drifted over me, and while I wanted to be angry at Jasper for messing with my emotions, I was more upset with myself that I needed it. I hid my face in Edward's neck again, and tried to keep better composure. Edward didn't seem to be upset at my burrowing. In fact, the more I snuggled into him, the more tightly he held me. I glanced up as his arms contracted around me, and he smiled encouragingly. If it helps you feel any better, Bella, I don't think they have a thing to worry about. Edward's smile grew a bit mischievous, his voice low, meant for me alone. But feel free to express your agitation in this manner whenever you like. That's all there was to it, really. Carlisle summed up the meeting. They wanted us to know that they could protect their territory and would be doing so, but also that they see it as our job to ensure that Bella is closely looked after. They don't want any accidents. There won't be. Edward was looking down at me again. But I'll be close by anyway in case Bella needs me. I smiled back at him and buried my nose against his neck again. Nothing in the world smelled better than Edward. I was delighted to get the permeating burn of werewolf out of my nose and replace it with the scent of something so appealing to me that nothing else mattered. I don't plan on needing the help, Edward, but you're welcome to hang around, just in case, I offered, my lips curving up into a smile against his skin. Rosie snorted disgustedly, rose to her feet, and headed up the stairs. That was anticlimactic. Come on, Emmett. Emmett leapt after her, with obvious reluctance. Aw, come on, babe. I heard Emmett say as he joined her. I wouldn't mind throwing down against a bunch of huge werewolves. I'll bet we could go run along the boundary line later and see if maybe one of them will cross it. I tuned the two of them out at that point. Emmett was the only one openly eager for a fight, and even he could be reasoned with. I never wanted to see a time where the two factions came to conflict. I wasn't so worried about the wolves myself, since I didn't know any of them other than Billy. But I knew my dad would be upset if any of his Quasliot friends got hurt or killed. Once Emmett and Rosalie had disappeared upstairs, Alice hopped to her feet, dragging Jasper along with her. Come on, Jazz, let's go hunting. Alice stopped just inside the opening to the living room, and she smiled at me. I'll be going home with you tomorrow. Bella, she informed me with a delighted smile. Midweek is going to be sunny, and I'm going to talk Charlie into letting you go camping with us. Then she giggled, an infectious, delighted sound, and danced out of the room with Jasper close behind. He turned to look at me before he left the room, tilting his head in the assessing way he had. Don't worry about it, Bella. Maybe resisting the thirst is your talent. Other than the way you confound Edward, there's not a thing wrong with super self-control. He directed a reassuring smile toward me, and then he took off after Alice. He's right, Bella, Esme assured me as I slid off Edward's lap. He stood as I did, ready to follow me. It was time to go back to Charlie's. You are strong enough to do whatever you need to. I was grateful for all of their faith and trust, and I smiled, leaning over to hug Esme tightly. You're too good to me, I told her softly before pulling away. Not all of us, but you're forgiving of even that, Edward said wryly, his eyes following the path Rosie had used to disappear up the stairs. She'll come around, I'm sure, Esme asserted before snuggling into Carlisle, who gave me his own version of a reassuring smile. Let's get back, Edward whispered to me, his honey eyes focused on my face. You don't want Charlie to wake and have you missing again. He was right. Charlie would wake soon. He led me out of the house, and we ran all the way back to Charlie's place. We'd spend the remainder of the night together, with only the sound of Charlie's snores to remind us that we weren't totally alone. I was perfectly content with that. Edward weaseled out of discussing that mind-numbing kiss just before the werewolf meeting. Whenever I would mention something close to it, he would bring up things that he knew would distract me. My mother was an easy topic to use. Renee and Phil were moving to Jacksonville, Florida. Phil had gotten a job coaching high school baseball, and they were moving to a place even sunnier than Phoenix. The situation with the werewolves made me almost crazy, setting off tremors in my hands. Even though Billy had agreed that I could stay with Charlie, I knew the Quaaludes were looking for a reason to make me leave. Alice came home from school with me the next day, as promised. Edward didn't seem to want to leave, but when it got close to the time for Charlie to come home, Alice kicked him out of the house. And don't hang around in the trees, she demanded. Go home this time. Esme misses you. She says that your piano is getting dusty. She literally pushed him out the door. Let Bella and me have some girl time. I laughed at her high-handed manner. She was so adorable that, even when she was being bossy, you let her because you loved her so much. We'll be fine, Edward. Alice will make sure that I don't go all violent newborn on Charlie's dinner, I assured him as he looked about to protest Alice making him leave early. It isn't time for Charlie to know about you yet. Alice pushed him again. In fact, if you're here, he won't allow Bella to spend sunny days with us. This will be much easier, and you know it. Edward sent a downcast look in my direction, and I took some small pity on him and walked over to plant a kiss on his cheek over Alice's shoulder. We hadn't kissed since the werewolf meeting. He was uncanny at keeping his distance when he wanted to, but I thought I could get away with this. I was right, he seemed to lean into the kiss before he grinned at me. Ruffled Alice's hair and then walked off the back porch and into the forest behind the house without any further protest. Alice turned back to grin at me in triumph before she followed me back to the kitchen, where I started to throw together Charlie's dinner. I do not know how you do this, Bella, she said as the smell of cooked fish filled the kitchen. Charlie was getting a fish salad tonight. I was really started to get creative with the edible things you could do with fish, and I hoped that my human memory wasn't fading so rapidly that I had no idea what would taste good anymore. Mind over matter, Alice. I smiled at her over my shoulder. You should see my dad in the kitchen. It's really a miracle he didn't die of starvation in the years after my mom and I left. She laughed, her bell-like trill filling the room as she settled down into a chair at the table, the one Edward usually sat in while he watched me cook. Bella, it isn't just because of the hiking that I'm here, Alice said after a moment of watching me at the stove. I know, Alice, you wouldn't have kicked Edward out so thoroughly if you were only here to talk to Charlie. I took the pan off the burner and set it aside on a hot pad before I turned to grin at her. Ah, Bella, you are getting to know me too well. I could tell by the smile on her face she loved it, though, while I knew she and Rosie were friendly, they were not exceptionally close. They were not best friends and total confidants that shared everything. Personally, I thought Rosie was too wrapped up in herself to really care deeply about anyone beside herself, except maybe Emmett. Perhaps. What's up, Alice? Is something wrong? Now that the fish was safe from burning, I walked over to sit down across from her. Bella, she started, looking at me quietly. You're having a hard time with things, and I thought you might want someone to talk to. I know Edward isn't the easiest person to talk to sometimes. I smiled slightly, shaking my head. A hard time with some things. I was having a hard time with everything. I wasn't even entirely sure just how deep things were getting with Edward. I knew how I felt. But we'd never talked about how he felt. Not really. The only time we'd talked about how he felt about me was just before the meeting with the werewolves. That was when he'd made his comment about me being everything that was important to him. But she was right. It was hard to talk to him about some of the things that lingered in my mind. He hadn't said outright how he felt. He said I was important, but that didn't mean that he had forever in mind. He had talked about how vampires chose their mates. Did he think we were mates? I wasn't sure. It was so difficult to believe that someone like Edward could love me. I was nothing out of the ordinary, and I was certainly not worthy of his affection. I'm okay, Alice. I think I'm just learning to cope right now. I'll be fine, really. I love that she cared enough to be concerned about me, though. I just wasn't sure how to get out all the things that were tearing me up inside, and I didn't think there were any easy solutions to be found. Very well, Bella. We don't have to chat about every little thing, but I want you to know that everything, that I can see at least, is going just as it should right now. Even with Edward, her smile was infectious, and I couldn't help but return it. Really? I was nervous. I didn't even want to hide it from Alice, and I don't think I could have anyway. Really? You worry too much about things that just don't matter, Bella? Alice's tone was slightly chiding. Now to the really important things. When are you going to let me put you in a dress or a skirt? I rolled my eyes and laughed, shaking my head. Only Alice would think what I was or wasn't wearing was something more important than everything else. I really wondered if it wasn't something she used to distract me. My dad would think it was strange for me to wear a skirt. Alice, remember how I was before? I certainly don't want to fall and have my skirt fly up into my face. I shuddered at the thought. That very thing had happened once. It was why I was still wary of skirts. They caused all kinds of trouble. Skirts were evil, horrible contraptions commonly worn with even more dangerous shoes. Alice shook her head at me, the disappointment easy to read on her face. Silly Bella. She outright smirked at me. You aren't going to fall and have your skirt fly up. Impossible. Remember? That doesn't mean that skirts and dresses are any less evil, I asserted, standing back up to finish Charlie's dinner. When Charlie walked into the house, Alice and I were ready for him. Dinner was ready and waiting, and Alice was standing politely beside the kitchen table, her hands folded demurely in front of her. I saw him blink in surprise as he looked at her. His gaze went from her to me and then back again. Several times. I suppose with her dark hair that the similarities between us were obvious: too pale skin, ultra-graceful economy of movement, brief moments of utter stillness that were observed and then over in the time it took to blink. I was suddenly glad that my contacts ensured that my eyes were a different color. That would have been too much for Charlie, I think. By the time my eyes faded to the same color as Alice's, we might still have to take measures around Charlie. However, it was likely that he'd just be used to it by then, so he'd ignore it. I could hope. Dad, this is Alice Cullen. She's Dr. Cullen's daughter. I introduced them with a smile. She's a friend of mine from school. Oh, Charlie was openly astonished as he continued to look from Alice to me. She's staying for dinner? I am afraid that I cannot, Chief Swan. Alice smiled at him in that irrepressible way that she had. She used that smile to charm people into doing whatever she wanted. But there is something I want to ask you. Charlie, my father corrected her with a slight clearing of his throat. You can call me Charlie, Alice. Good to see Bella's made some friends at school. It took Charlie a second to break from the thorough, dazzling Alice had delivered. By the time he did, he realized she said she wanted to ask him something. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as I watched him try to shake off Alice's enchantment. She was still smiling at him, and I coughed, trying not to smirk. Well, Charlie, I don't know if you heard, but my family loves to go camping. On sunny days, she paused to give him her most innocent look. You know they're so rare here. And yeah, on sunny days, my parents take us out of school and we all go camping. We don't usually go very far, and my mom, she's great, makes sure that we still study while we're gone. You know, around the campfire, so we don't get behind in school or anything. I had to turn a little to hide my amusement, not wanting to give away Alice's lies. She was really pouring it on. She sounded just like a teenager, a polite, precise, and dazzling teenager. I was really hoping that you would allow Bella to accompany us. Esme would be delighted to help ensure that she keeps up with her homework, just like the rest of us. Alice, at this point, actually batted her lashes at my poor, unsuspecting father, and I nearly choked trying to keep my expression bland. Well, I'm not sure about that, Alice. That's a lot of school, and Bella's not much of a hiker. Charlie looked over at me conspiratorially as though he was helping to extract me from a life-threatening situation, and he was willing to play the heavy to help me get out of it. I'll be all right, Dad. I tried not to look too eager or amused. Alice's family really is great at this camping thing, and they don't even hike much. Do you, Alice? They own a couple of properties, and I think Alice even mentioned four-wheelers or something. Not that I would drive one, of course. Esme says that I can ride behind her when they go up to the more remote campsites. My dad blinked back at me in shock, and when I gave him a nod that confirmed that I wanted to be included in this, he looked back at Alice. He was sure to be thinking about whether or not he wanted me to go. Just because I let him know what I wanted didn't mean he'd go along with it. Alice waited patiently, letting Charlie think things out, and then he looked over at me again. You sure about this, Bells? Hiking? Charlie sounded so concerned. This time I did smile. Dad, both of Alice's parents are always right there, and Dr. Cullen is a doctor. Even if I trip and hurt something, he'd be able to take care of me immediately. I'm probably safer with Alice's family than I am here in town on my own. I observed speculatively. Even if it wasn't true anymore, it had been, and he was fully aware that we were all very lucky that my mother's job had an excellent medical plan. I hadn't used it in months, obviously, but before I'd become a vampire, it saved my parents from bankruptcy. Well, that's certainly true, Charlie confirmed wryly. Your parents are fine with this, Alice. It was their idea, Alice confirmed, with the most innocent look on her face that I had ever seen in my life. I couldn't believe that anyone could actually do that without making it look contrived. Oh, she'd surprised him this time and was giving him very little room to not agree. I was very glad that he hadn't met Edward yet, or there would be no chance he'd say yes. And your brothers? Not that he wasn't aware there were 3 teenage boys in their house, I reminded myself. My father was a cop, and while he talked himself into missing certain things about me on purpose, the close, overnight proximity to boys was not something he was just going to gloss over. Oh, I wouldn't worry about the boys, Charlie. They often wander off to camp on their own. They always want to go deeper into the woods than the girls do, at least for the night. It's often just my parents, me and Rose in the main campsite. Alice deflected with the talent of a master. Charlie's eyes darted back to me again, and I just looked quietly back at him and waited to see if he would make my life just this much easier. Well, I guess that's fine if your parents will be supervising the whole time, Alice. I didn't relax, but I did quietly start to spoon out his dinner right onto the plate in front of him. Distraction. Charlie was really starting to like having me home to cook for him all the time, and I was reminding him quietly that I hadn't asked for anything since I'd moved here. Oh, of course they will, Charlie. Alice squealed in delight at his agreement, jumped over to hug me and him, and then danced her way out of the kitchen to grab her coat from the hall mats. I have to run home. Esme has dinner waiting, and she'll want to know right away. She wants to pick somewhere really fun to take Bella to for the first time. Alice was gone in the next few breaths in a whirlwind of activity that left Charlie sitting at the table and looking far more exhausted than he did when he'd walked in the door. I returned to the kitchen after seeing Alice out and smiled at the look on his face. She does that to everyone, Dad. I let him off the hook, and he gave me a look of such gratitude I almost laughed. "That girl is a force of nature," he described as he finally reached for his dinner, shaking his head. "Yes," I agreed quietly. "And she's wonderful." I leaned over to hug my father. "Thank you, Dad. Alice is incredible. I think we could really be great friends." Other than Edward, she was my best friend, but that was a subject I was avoiding still. "Well, just make sure your grades don't drop, Bella." Charlie had to throw out a parental warning, since I'm sure he thought he was letting me get away with something. "I won't, Dad. Actually, my grades are better here than they were in Phoenix," I reminded him as I reached for some salad. "Yeah, I guess they are. Your mom's kinda sad about that. She keeps calling to make sure you're still okay and keeps prodding me about making sure you don't want to come live with her in Jacksonville." He smiled at that, amusement in his eyes. "Glad you're enjoying it here, Bells. I like having you around the house." At his last comment, he looked away uncomfortably and focused on his food. Emotional things were difficult for my dad to handle, but we understood each other anyway. This was his way of saying that he loved me and didn't want me to leave, no matter what my mom said. "I do like it here, Dad," I soothed him and finished off the bits of salad I knew I had to force down. "And speaking of homework, I have a paper due in English tomorrow. Mind if I head upstairs early?" He just nodded as he shoveled more fish over a fresh helping of salad and waved a fork at me in farewell as I got up. "Don't worry about cleaning up, I got it." I heard him lift his voice around the mouthful of food, and I hurried upstairs before I broke out into laughter. Alice was an artist, and I was glad she was on my side. The next few weeks were both difficult and wonderful for me. When it was just Edward babysitting me, I didn't mind at all. Our relationship was so much more than his just keeping an eye on me. We spent time together because neither of us wanted to be anywhere else. But now, the werewolves had sent Billy Black to babysit me too, and it was making everything that much harder. Edward and I got our time alone together, until about the time Charlie was supposed to be home, and then Billy and Jacob would show up at the door. Their TV was broken, or so they said, and apparently it is football season. When there wasn't a super important game on, Billy always seemed to find something he could not go without watching at night. Charlie didn't seem to mind the company, but I avoided Billy pointedly. Jacob refused to be avoided, though his father shot him dirty looks behind Charlie's back. Billy could hardly object to Jacob sitting in the kitchen with me to work on homework. While Jacob wasn't much help for me since homework was all too easy these days, I was able to provide him with some assistance. He was in a grade lower, and I'd done all of the same work the year before. Edward didn't like this development, and he was pressuring me to tell Charlie that we were dating now so he could openly be there on these evenings. I really didn't want to do that, because I needed to be allowed to go camping with the Cullens on sunny days. Permission could easily be revoked if Charlie knew that my boyfriend was also included in these outings. Edward sulked and protested, but always went out to wait in the trees when Charlie got home. Spending time with Jacob, though, was growing to be a lot of fun. He was like the strange younger brother I never had. Jacob always provided something that made me laugh, demonstrating a wicked sense of humor that saw the truth in things. He never let me get away with anything, seeing straight through most of my crap. The only exceptions to that were the things that were too fantastic to believe. I had to admit part of me wasn't willing to give up this time with Jacob, even though I knew Edward worried about me. He knew that Billy expected Jacob to have the werewolf gene, and he knew werewolves, especially new werewolves, were quite dangerous. Edward said that new werewolves had uncertain tempers and could shift without warning, harming or killing anyone who just happened to be in their way. I hadn't seen any of this intemperance in Jacob, however. He seemed too happy and well-adjusted to be so suddenly violent. But I also knew that Edward had previous experience with Jacob's tribe. He'd actually known Jacob's great-grandfather or something, so I was willing to give him the benefit of prior knowledge. Jacob knew that I had a secret boyfriend, someone Billy disapproved of, but we didn't talk about it. I also knew that Jacob was far more fond of me, at least in a different way, than I was of him. I knew where my feelings lay, and the very nice boy who was often across the table from me just wasn't Edward. Edward and I still had all night, every night together, but I knew he stiffly waited close by to come if I needed him whenever Billy and Jacob were at the house. The sunny days, though, were amazing. The Cullens didn't actually go camping together on these days. In fact, the couples often took off into the mountains on their own for some quiet time. A house full of vampires with supernatural hearing was nowhere near private. But many days they did hang out together, and Edward and I spent a lot of this time with various members of his family. Quite often, Edward and I would find ourselves in their favorite clearing in the mountains with everyone else. This was not one of Edward's favorite ways to spend these days, but I occasionally insisted upon it. Jasper and Emmett had taken it upon themselves to teach me how to fight the way a vampire did. I loved these sessions, sparring actively with both men, learning how not to react like a newborn, and instead to use my mind and body to become a weapon that any vampire would think twice about messing with. Jasper was fascinating to fight, using scores of years of experience fighting and the emotional climate around his opponent to effect a ruthless win. Emmett was much more straightforward, using his well-developed physical skills to deliver crushing attacks that would do crippling damage if he intended it. Edward sat out of these sessions, telling me he was absolutely unable to see me as a target and to attack me in that manner. I understood what he meant. I wasn't sure that I could attack him as seriously as I did Jasper and Emmett. We didn't spend all of our time with the rest of the family. Edward and I took advantage of the quiet sometimes, too. He'd play his piano for me, and we'd listen to music or work ahead on homework just for the fun of doing it together. Other times, we'd take off into the mountains alone, or he'd take me to his meadow where we'd lay in the grass and talk. We never did anything more than hold hands and talk, but these times were some of the best of my life. I wasn't just learning about the history of Edward and his family. I was learning about how he thought, about the insight that he had into other people's minds. Often he would give me a play-by-play of the things people were thinking during school. He would distract me with the unusual, the amusing, how Eric Yorkie would sing the alphabet song in his head repeatedly if he got bored during classes, and how Lauren Mallory had gotten the brush from her mascara caught in her eyelashes as she'd slathered it on so thick one day. Apparently, she'd almost pulled them all out trying to free it. He wasn't malicious about most of his comments, though he never had anything good to say about Mike. I found that I was starting to dislike Mike nearly as much as Edward did. Some part of me wondered, if Mike was so awful, then why didn't Edward take the effort to dislike him before my arrival? I eventually discounted it as a male thing that I'd probably never understand, and thus mostly ignored it. Some weeks into the cycle of switching out babysitters, I could not stand the look on Edward's face when he left Charlie's house before dinner time any longer. That night, instead of going hunting, I dragged Edward to his house and tracked down Carlisle. We found the Cullen patriarch in his study, reading a book written by one of the philosophers of the early 20th century. He looked up from the book as we entered and moved from his position standing near a bookshelf to sit at the desk, gesturing for us to take chairs across from him. "What can I do for the both of you?" Carlisle asked politely. His smile was indulgent. Carlisle and Esme had been watching the relationship develop between Edward and me with undisguised delight. Carlisle had originally changed Rosie as a mate for Edward, but the two were incompatible as it was quickly learned, and he'd given up trying to provide for Edward the peace he felt in his relationship with Esme. It wasn't something you could hope or wish for. Either you found your mate, or you didn't. It wasn't something that anyone could manipulate. I settled into a chair as Edward looked over at me. He had no idea what I was after, but was tolerant as he often was with me. I looked up at Carlisle and smiled at him slowly. "Carlisle, I have a problem. It's not a big one, but I think that it's one with which you can help." I started. "Charlie is understandably very protective of me since I moved here, more so than usual. We've had to hide that Edward and I involved so that he'll allow the camping trips with your family. I admit that I have so much to hide from Charlie that I don't like hiding something that should be so simple to share." My words prompted a smile from Edward as he grabbed my hand and curled his fingers around mine. He could see where I was going with this now. "I think if you went and talked to him, Carlisle, it might be able to make this one thing right. Let him know that you've noticed that we're getting closer, but you'll take an active interest in what's going on and make sure that everything is proper, as it should be." I grinned at Edward and then turned back to Carlisle. "It seems like such a little thing, but it would soothe things over with Charlie so much, and Edward wouldn't have to leave me alone every evening with an unpredictable werewolf." I wrinkled my nose at Edward since he knew I didn't mind the time with Jacob. "I'm not worried about it, but he's been pacing a hole into the forest behind Charlie's house." Carlisle laughed, knowing how obsessive Edward could be, especially about me. Edward rolled his eyes at me, but pulled my hand up to leave soft kisses across its back. "You think that will be enough for Charlie?" Edward asked against my skin, and I smiled at him, nodding. "He won't be delighted about it, but I know he respects Carlisle quite a bit, and won't quickly refuse him. Carlisle's a responsible adult, you know." I grinned back at Carlisle, winking at him mischievously. "I would be delighted to take care of that for you, Bella." Carlisle smiled openly at us as he leaned across his desk, folding his fingers together on the solid surface in front of him. In fact, I'll call him in the morning and see if he can spare me a few moments during the day tomorrow. It is not a conversation that you'll want me to have with him while Billy Black is camped in front of your TV. I grinned at Carlisle and then dragged Edward up by the hand again, taking him most willingly toward the door. Thank you, Carlisle. I suddenly turned my head and grinned at Edward. What was that you said about challenging Emmett to arm wrestling? Carlisle got to his feet to follow us at that, and Edward laughed as we headed downstairs together. We found Emmett at the TV, battling with Jasper at Halo 3. Emmett had tried to make an art out of destroying Jasper's game scores by multiples instead of just the usual kill count, and he played dirty. I stood behind the couch and noticed that Jasper actually had a higher score at this point, and decided to take advantage of the opportunity to mess with Emmett. Hey, Emmett, is Jasper's thumping you again? I taunted from the spot right behind where he sat on the couch. Edward smothered a laugh and reached up to cover his grin behind his hand. Carlisle and the rest of the family started to file into the room behind us, and I grinned at them. Alice peeked around at me and then laughed delightedly as the vision obviously came to her of what I was about to do. Emmett turned to look at me as I spoke, and Jasper immediately killed him again. I laughed. You know, if you're feeling low, you could take a break and teach me how to arm wrestle. Edward says you're especially good at it. I couldn't hide the challenge in my voice, though I tried to measure it with a hint of admiration. Jasper looked up from the game at that point, and then dropped the controller and got to his feet. Being the family expert on newborns, I imagine he knew what was going to happen and didn't want to miss it for the world. I'm good at all kinds of things, Bella, Emmett agreed with a smirk. I knew his brain knew that I was supposed to be stronger than he was, but I don't think he actually considered that a much smaller girl could beat him at anything physical. Our battles in the clearing hadn't disabused him of the notion, since his fighting skills were so much better than mine. He abandoned his game as Jasper had, and reached out to turn off the TV before leading the way out the back door. There's this great boulder back here, since Esme objects to us playing games like this in the house. Emmett sounded slightly disgusted at the restriction, but he turned to grin at Esme as she reached out to smack him on the arm. What? Edward lifted my hand up to brush his lips over the back of my fingers again, laughing as the family started to file out and gather in the clearing near the river behind the house. Thank you, he said, eyes twinkling. This was mostly because Edward had won our race, but also I knew he owed his brother some humiliation. Emmett had been harassing him lately about our relationship and how far it had or hadn't gone, and we both thought he deserved a little payback. I walked over to the boulder that was sitting so conveniently just above waist level and grinned across it at Emmett as I released Edward's hand. You know, Emmett, I began, adding in a bit of my own fun. This whole thing isn't according to the Cullen family tradition, if we don't make a little wager, is it? Everyone looked at me in surprise, and I winked at Alice as she hopped up and down and clapped happily. Well, Jasper and I usually place a friendly little wager on lots of things, Emmett confirmed with a confused look on his face. Well, how about if I win? You don't bother Edward and me about our relationship anymore. The werewolves are up in my face about my life enough. I wrinkled my nose at the mention of werewolves, and Emmett laughed, shaking his head at me. Sure, Bella, but if I win, I get to take Edward aside and give him the talk about the birds and the bees. Emmett cast a loaded grin at Edward, who groaned. I have several medical degrees, Emmett, Edward protested. Trust me, I know the mechanics. That's not the point, Emmett insisted. We're negotiating terms here, Edward. That's what I want when I win. I grinned over at Edward and tilted my head in question at him. He was the one who was going to have to deal with the fallout if I happened to lose, and I wasn't about to commit to it for him. The look Edward gave me in answer was warm and affectionate, openly expressing his thoughts at the moment. I have faith in you, Bella, he said softly, leaning over to kiss me, and then stepped back to make room for the contest. All right, how's the best way to do this? I asked. I'd really never done any arm wrestling other than silly messing around with my mother. Emmett leaned over on the rock, showing me how to stand and where to place my arm, and I leaned over, matching his posture and position. So, we have a bet then, Emmett. I confirmed, looking him in the eyes as our hands wrapped together over the boulder, and I smiled at him confidently. Yeah, sure, can't wait to take him aside and give him the talk. Emmett grinned over at Rosier, who just shook her head at him. Carlisle acted as the referee and gave us a countdown to the start. I was truly surprised at how easy it was to hold Emmett's hand straight up in place. He was pushing against me so hard that the boulder started to crumble slightly under our arms. compacting beneath the force. I saw it. I understood the forces involved, but they really mattered little to me. Emmett looked up at me in shock, and I grinned back at him, and then quietly pressed his hand all the way down, touching the back of his knuckles to the boulder for the win. I leapt back right after Carlisle called the winner, and Edward grabbed me around the waist and swung me around in the air for several rotations before he let me down and pulled me into his arms. I had to laugh at the look of joy on his face. He was such a different man than he was that day when he'd pulled me out of biology. He seemed always filled with joy now, and I certainly wasn't any different. I loved it when Edward was happy. Emmett, though, slammed his fists down on the boulder in a fit of temper, and it cracked right in two. I turned my head to watch and laughed at the look on his face. It wasn't really anger, frustrated mostly as he stomped away into the grass and kicked at the dirt. The rest of us laughed at the temper tantrum he was throwing, and Rosie sighed and rolled her eyes at his antics. Emmett could be big and scary, but in so many ways he was such a little boy. My eyes returned to the man who held me in his arms, and I looked up at him and grinned. "Hey, Edward," I asked, and I knew my happiness filled my eyes. "What, Bella?" he returned, grinning down at me and dropping a too-quick kiss on my lips. "Since Carlisle will be talking to Charlie tomorrow, how about you stop by and help me with my homework after dinner?" I offered, grinning up at the man who was the complete center of my existence now. He laughed and swung me up again before he pulled me back into his arms and hugged me tightly. I wasn't going to break, so I didn't mind when he hugged me so tightly. "Bella," he said as he smiled down at me, "I love you. Now let's go hunting before it becomes too late." I stopped and gaped, unable to do anything but stare at him as he dragged me into the woods. We soon took off running. Edward had never told me he loved me before. I figured that what he felt for me was probably becoming close to that. Every action spelled it out to me, but it was incredible to hear him say it outright. I laughed joyously and took off racing, challenging my love to keep up with me, as we sped off into the night. As we ran, another section from Sonnets from the Portuguese came to me, summing up the feeling in my soul at this moment so well. And when I say indeed I love thee, mark, I love thee in thy sight, I stand transfigured, glorified, aright, with conscience of the new rays that proceed out of my face toward thine. A hunt was necessary before we went back to Charlie's house, but it didn't take long. A short time later, we climbed up the tree and into my bedroom window. As had become our habit, when returning from our nightly forays, we sat together on my bed and talked. I was in my favorite spot, the one I had always enjoyed. But instead of my books tucked up against me, I had Edward. He would pull me into his arms, and I would lay my head on his shoulder, and we would talk about whatever came to mind. Edward was particularly absorbed with learning how I thought so, that he could figure out what I was thinking. I constantly confounded him, no matter what we talked about, or so he said. No matter what question he asked me, no matter what the subject, I always said something that he didn't expect. He could anticipate some things, but for the most part, I was a closed book to my love when it came to him anticipating what I would say. Tonight was no different. We were talking about sacrifice and love, and he had just asserted that he loved me more than I loved him. He was wrong, of course. He was so very much more that the thought of him being able to love me more than I did him was just ludicrous. In looks alone, Edward was an angel, tousled bronze hair, clear honey eyes, a body any man would envy. There was no doubt that he surpassed me. Compared to him, I was plain, mousy brown hair. Evil-looking crimson eyes, too petite for any real curves. Womanly curves that I might have grown into if I had continued to mature as a human. Though I didn't offer my lack of a Marilyn Monroe figure as evidence in our discussion. It was too embarrassing. He refused to agree that any of this had any substance, however, insisting that I was anything but plain and that he was anything but spectacular. This debate ended in laughter, and with him looking down at me seriously, his eyes drilling into mine. "I do love you, Bella, so much more than I can even express. You are the center of my life now. You are everything to me. Do you not know how empty I was before you came along? The sole seventh wheel in a house full of perfectly matched pairs." His voice was hoarse as he revealed his pain to me. We'd never talked about this specifically before, but I had seen this. I had watched during those early days as his family always paired off. Emmett and Rosie were very demonstrative in their relationship, and Emmett's mind was a clear pool to Edward. It was often filled with Rosie and the uncomfortable details of their bond. Alice and Jasper were far more circumspect, Jasper's empathy allowing him to show more concern in their interactions where others would be affected. But with Alice and Jasper, it was also more than that. Jasper and Alice's connection was so deep, so much a sacred part of them, that it wasn't something they felt was for public consumption. Carlisle and Esme were nearly as sensitive as Alice and Jasper, but like all truly deep relationships, there were thoughts of their love that were nearly always in their heads, foremost in their thoughts. As vampires, our minds could process and think through so much more, so some part of his family's minds were always on their spouses. How he kept track of so much noise filling his head, how he filtered enough out to even hear details. I was never sure, but he had somehow learned to cope with it. It was such a useful skill to have since so much of our world was in hiding in plain sight. Edward enabled his family to do that so much more successfully. He was able to see when someone suspected something. Afterward, they would quietly disappear. I knew they moved a lot, the only way to hide that no one was aging. I was not looking forward to this fact, hoping that we would be able to linger near Charlie and visit Renee for at least 10 more years. I reached up to touch his face as his pained words brushed across me. Did I know the real depth of his loneliness? As I looked up into his face, I smiled slightly. You know, I was sitting here the night before I started school, and I was reading that book of poems. I gestured with my head to the book sitting on top of the stack on my desk. Sonnets from the Portuguese. He smiled down at me. You are a closet romantic. There is nothing closet about it, I laughed softly, still careful not to wake Charlie, but I read one of her sonnets that described that pain. It felt so right to me, I felt like I would be alone forever. He paused a moment, as though trying to recall which of the sonnets in that book would describe such loss. Most of those poems were love poems about the power of the love and the attachment that the author felt for her poet husband. Then Edward smiled, looking back down at me. He'd remembered the stanza, pulling it from the book with his perfect memory. Hush, call no echo up in further proof of desolation. There's a voice within that weeps as thou must sing, alone, aloof, Edward recited to me softly, and I smiled back at him. It felt so true, so perfect, though I have to say, a couple of days later, I no longer felt that way. I no longer felt so alone, so isolated. That's because I have not allowed you many moments alone since I discovered you, he admitted, brushing his fingertip across my cheekbone. Classes at school, we don't share. Charlie's time, the time it takes for you to run home and get ready for school. I calculated, then grinned at him. Nope, not a lot of alone time. I don't mind, though. That complete loneliness fled at first sight of you. Suddenly I gasped, realizing what I was saying, and I groaned and buried my face in his shirt. He laughed and refused to allow me to hide, tipping my face up with a gentle finger. Well, are you saying that you developed a thing for me from the first moment you saw my face in that school cafeteria? He was terribly amused by the idea, and I stuck my tongue out at him, refusing to admit to it verbally. Again. Well, I had seen you all day long through the eyes of the other students. They were so absorbed in you, fascinated, especially Mike. Even before I knew you and what you would mean to me, I wanted to kill him for his thoughts. He really is a dirty little boy. Edward was very direct about how much he disliked Mike, especially after the confrontation. He hasn't stopped, you know. Edward looked away for a moment, then back into my face. He still fantasizes about you almost constantly. I can hardly blame him, though. He's only human. His last statement was a bit caustic, and I had to laugh. Reaching up to place both hands on each side of his head, I leaned over to press my nose gently against his. Yes, but I'm not, I reminded him gently. Mike would try to kiss me, and I'd be sinking my teeth. I trailed off shivering at the thought. I was not even able to say it, but Edward fully understood. I wouldn't mind so much if you drained him dry. Accidentally, of course. But I know how much it would hurt you to lose control like that. I don't want that for you, Bella. Edward's tone was far too serious again. You are so good, every part of you. I don't want you to become the monster that I am. I love you so deeply that I would leave if I were strong enough. Give you the chance to be with someone who is good. Someone with a soul as beautiful as yours. I blinked, staring into his sad face. My mind was a bit more sluggish in processing this last bit of information. I knew that he'd gone off the wagon for some years, leaving Carlisle and hunting the scum of society. He had explained that he thought he was doing the entire world a favor by eliminating such terrible people. The weight of even those kills, however, weighed heavily on his heart. Edward thought he'd lost his soul in those painful years, but I knew better. I have found someone whose soul matches mine, Edward, I said through gritted teeth, still holding his head between my hands. He's right here, right in my hands, and I'm not ever letting go. If you run from me, from this wonderful thing between us, I will hunt you down. The last 3 words were emphasized, each said quite separately. My words were a promise, and I knew he felt it. I had given up so much adjusting to this life. He was the best part of it, the center of my world, just as he insisted I was the center of his. You are it, Edward. There will never be anyone else for me. I leaned in to kiss him softly as my words trailed off, and for the first time since the night of the werewolf meeting, he met my lips eagerly, wrapping his arms around me tightly. The kiss was brief, but full of the absolute devotion that we both felt. Edward was my everything now. I would live without Charlie and Renee when it was time to move on. But I could not live without Edward. As long as he was with me, we could go anywhere. Do anything. He was mine. And I was his until the end of time. Beside him was the only place I wanted to be. To me, that was heaven. Edward, I said, trying to draw his attention. Remember when we talked about me burying that box? We hadn't spoken about it since I told him I had it. But I wanted him, at least to open it, to slice into the package, and see if he knew the man who had killed me. I was looking for avoidance more than retribution. He nodded, giving me a curious look. Let's open it tonight. I want to know if you know him, I admitted with some reticence. He nodded finally after a moment and followed me out the window. It didn't take us long to find. With absolutely perfect memory, I knew exactly where I'd buried it. My vampire claws dug through the ground like it was water, so it didn't take very long to dig up. I hadn't gone very deep. When I had the box in my hand, I walked over to a nearby tree and leaned against it, holding the box in front of me. Edward came over to join me, looking at the little package. Are you sure you want to do this, Bella? He asked me gently. I responded with a nod. Yes. I gave him a smile and opened the box, revealing the sealed plastic bundle within. I took it out, leaving the seal in place, and handed it to him. Here, you can open it, I offered, leaning back on the tree as I watched him. He looked at the plastic and ripped the end off with one slash of his nails. I held my breath carefully. I remembered what it smelled like, and I didn't need the refresher. Edward took a deep breath and jolted in surprise, gasping in pain. Edward? His reaction shocked me. I knew the scent of human blood was pungent, but this was stronger than the normal reaction, and Edward was quite practiced. Bella, he finally gasped out, curling his fingers around the fabric of the torn shirt as he pulled it out. It is a very good thing you didn't move here as a human. That scent, he trailed off, having difficulty with expressing himself, and he looked back up at me. I wouldn't have been able to keep myself from killing you, he finally admitted. Even though it's faded with time and the death of the cells, this is the sweetest blood I have ever smelled. You would have been irresistible. There was a hint of regret in his expression, but it was quickly covered with self-hatred. My mate, I would have ended your life within moments of inhaling your scent. The words were forced as though he was desperately reluctant to admit this weakness. I reached out to touch his hand, wanting to stop this spiral into self-loathing. I took a careful breath to give me a second to gather together just what I wanted to say. Edward, it didn't happen. I was changed when I came here, and you protected me. He gave me a weak smile before lifting the t-shirt to inhale again. He was trying to accomplish what we came here to do, even though being around the scent of my old blood was difficult for him. It's hard for me to get past the smell of your blood, but I can detect the scent of one vampire right on the fabric. Nothing of a second. She never touched you. Not while I was conscious, I said quietly, nodding. Ah, no, it isn't familiar to me, Bella, he said with some disappointment. He knew that I wanted to be able to identify who had done this to me. I'm sorry. With some reluctance and one last inhale of the blood on the fabric, he tucked it back into the plastic and then into the box. I'll take it home with me when I go change for school and see if someone else recognizes it. Jasper and Carlisle know the most vampires. He set the box back into the hole again and covered it with some dirt until it was time for him to head home. It wasn't something either of us wanted to deal with at Charlie's. Edward? I didn't really know how to ask this, but it was suddenly important for me to know. Are there people whose blood calls to us more strongly than others? People who cannot be resisted? Edward glanced over at the box, then back at me, and he shrugged. I didn't think so, Bella, but it seems that there are... I'll ask about that, too. Dear heaven, Edward, What if my mother had smelled like that to me? I stood there nervously, aware that I was as close to shock as I'd been in a long time. He just shook his head and took me into his arms again, holding me. It cannot be that common, Bella, he said softly into my hair. I am so much older than you, and this is the first I've ever been near an aroma that irresistible. I'll find out what I can. Let's get you back to your house, so Charlie doesn't worry. As we returned to my room and settled into our usual spots, I tried to think of something to distract me from this new threat. Suddenly, I remembered something that he'd promised to explain later, but kept avoiding. Edward, I started, giving him a severe look. I wasn't letting him get away this time. Remember that kiss in the clearing before Carlisle and I went to meet the werewolves? His expression grew wary, and he just nodded. Want to explain that to me? You've been avoiding answering me. Oh, that. He looked a bit sheepish. Bella, you know that I have been keeping you at arm's length to a degree. It's just, well, a bit embarrassing. I just watched him, silently waiting. He wasn't getting out of this explanation. Well, it's just so easy to get carried away when I'm with you, he spoke slowly, as though he were trying to find the best way possible to explain this to me. There are some things that I simply think should wait just a bit longer. We shouldn't rush into the physical side of our relationship. I blinked at that and looked down at my hands as I curled them together repeatedly. Some feelings and urges run a bit stronger as vampires, especially with our mates, he continued softly. I just want our relationship to progress as we want it to, not because we get caught up in the moment. He was still holding something back. I could tell. By this time, however, I was so embarrassed that I could only nod mutely. I could understand his reluctance to discuss the physical aspects of our relationship. I certainly wasn't comfortable talking about that sort of thing either. He tugged on my hand and drew it up to his lips to press a kiss to my skin. But I hope that you know that whatever you're feeling, it is absolutely mutual. I love you, Bella, and I'll always want to be with you, he said softly, his lips brushing my skin. I smiled back at him. Right there, right then, it was good to be me. During school the next day, we found out that Carlisle had been able to speak with Charlie about Edward and me. Carlisle had called Edward on his cell phone at lunch to impart the good news. I wouldn't have to hide my relationship with Edward from my father anymore. Edward would be able to spend more time at the house. There would be even less time apart from him. I never wanted to be apart from him. I was downright giddy for the rest of the day, clinging to Edward's hand as he walked me to my classes and reaching up to press ecstatic kisses on his pleased face whenever I could. I had never been so publicly demonstrative with him before, and he was disturbingly delighted by it. Throughout the rest of the day, he beamed with satisfaction. I gave him a suspicious look on our way to biology. Mike, he said smugly by way of explanation, you have always been so quiet and distant at school that he thought he still had a chance. He's upset that you're showing me so much attention. I laughed. Edward was enjoying making Mike jealous. We sat down at our shared table when we arrived in the classroom. I moved my books off to the side, away from Edward, so I could sit closer to him. I'm not that much more affectionate, I tried to defend, but he only laughed at the look on my face. I propped my head in one hand. An old habit, I'd continued. You are enjoying his pain far too much, Edward Cullen. I had a hard time believing that Mike was really so oblivious. How could he have missed just how close he had come to dying? I noticed human reactions to Jasper. They knew to be afraid of him. There was something about him that always bordered on feral when he was around humans. I knew that there had to have been some of that in my expression that day after gym. He deserves it. Even Jessica doesn't deserve to have to put up with him. But she seems to want him anyway. Edward shook his head, completely baffled, and I laughed again, enjoying this simple time with him. Several heads turned our way at my laughter, but I ignored them and turned my seat so that I could snuggle into Edward's side. This was the one place that I felt truly at peace. Edward's arms. After school that day, Edward came home with me as he always did, but he didn't rise from his chair when the time came that he usually left. I heard Charlie's cruiser coming closer along the street and smiled at Edward as I started to set 3 dishes on the table. You sure you want to give up the sneaking around? That does have its merits too, you know? I teased him gently since I knew that he was really looking forward to not having to hide anymore. Oh, I still get to sneak around with you every night, he grinned at me. So I'm keeping the good parts and getting others that are better. He looked so smug again that I couldn't stop laughing whenever I saw his face. All right. You know, I'm not sure how to describe you to Charlie. Boyfriend sounds so trite and temporary. You are so much more than that. I couldn't hide my nervousness. Edward rose from his spot and walked over to kiss me gently. I know, Bella. I feel the same. But boyfriend is a term that Charlie will understand. He grinned. If you start talking about following me around for eternity, Charlie might decide that my family has started a cult and you're not allowed around us anymore. I smiled at him. He was trying to cheer me up and make me less nervous. I was glad that Charlie wasn't as perceptive as Renee when it came to things like this. Renee would see right through me in an instant. She would know that what I felt for Edward was so much more than I admitted. Just then, Charlie unlocked the door and walked into the house, hollering out a greeting as he hung up his gun and then sauntered into the kitchen. He didn't look at all surprised to see Edward there. His eyes narrowed at me, and I just smiled at him sheepishly. Dad, this is Edward Cullen, Alice's brother. Edward, this is my father, Charlie. Still an old-fashioned guy. My dad liked the proper introductions. Edward, Charlie greeted with a cold look at Edward, who had been back in the chair when he walked in the room, though Edward had risen to greet my father. Chief Swan, Edward said, returning the greeting. I rolled my eyes. Men? Were they really standing there posturing at each other? Edward is my lab partner in biology, Dad, I explained. We've got a test coming up, and I thought we might study together after dinner if that's okay with you. Charlie shot Edward a suspicious look and glanced down at the table set for 3 before he looked at me, sighed, then settled into his chair. I take it you're staying for dinner then, Edward? Charlie asked as he shifted his weight to get comfortable. Edward helped me gather together the rest of dinner, and then sat when I did. If that's acceptable, sir, Edward offered Charlie the chance to send him home, though I knew it was hard for him if only to be polite. Yeah, sure, Charlie agreed reluctantly, and settled into his favorite spot. Tonight, dinner was Grandma Swan's beef stroganoff. I was buttering Charlie up, tempting him to be nice to Edward, and everyone in the room knew it. It must have worked, at least a bit. Throughout dinner, Charlie didn't make one snarky comment about Edward being there. Charlie finished his meal before wandering toward the living room, just as the doorbell rang. I sighed. There be werewolves here, I thought with a sigh, as I got up to clean the kitchen. Ever the gentleman, Edward reached for several dishes on the table, helping me with the cleanup. Jacob bounded, and moments later, casting a shocked look at me when he saw Edward helping me clear away the remnants of dinner. I smiled back at him. Jake! Meet Edward. Edward, this is Jake. He's a friend, I clarified as though Edward didn't already know how I felt about Jacob. It's very nice to meet you, Jake. Edward nodded politely as he reached for the last of the dinner dishes on the table. Edward and I have a test in biology tomorrow, and we need to study tonight, I said to Jacob for my father's benefit, since I knew both he and Billy were listening from the other room. Cool. I just have a bit of math homework tonight, Jacob said as he slumped down into the chair Charlie had recently vacated. Good thing it's not more. I'm not feeling so well tonight. Tried to get my dad to leave me home, but he insisted that we be here. Said I shouldn't get behind on my homework or something. I rolled my eyes as I turned to rinse the dishes in the sink. Edward and I knew why Billy wasn't going to back down about the visit. He couldn't stand to leave me unsupervised and was checking to make sure I hadn't killed Charlie. This was the uncomfortable daily reminder that the wolves are watching melodramatic drivel. I wanted to tell the Quaaludes to go watch themselves. I was just fine. Besides, if I wanted to kill Charlie, there was nothing Billy could do to stop me even if he were present for it. Jacob slumped even further in the chair and set his head down on the table, folding his arms under his head. I blinked in astonishment. Jacob was never like this. Usually, he was almost like a person-sized sun irrepressibly spinning around Charlie's house. I probably shouldn't have, but I reached out to touch his forehead and blinked, looking up at Edward in open shock. He's burning up. I looked back down as Jacob grabbed my cold hand and held it against his blistering hot skin. Wow, Bella, have you been playing in the freezer? He was surprised at my temperature, but then Jacob surprised me like he always did. That feels great. You should play in the freezer all the time if you'll let me use your hand like an ice pack. Edward leaned forward and set a finger next to mine in a manner that would hide it as my touch, instead of his. He removed it quickly, giving me a short nod as he returned to his chair and spread his biology book on the table in front of him. Looks like Jacob will soon join the pack, Edward confirmed in a whisper that was too low for human ears. For a second, his eyes focused on Jacob with a hint of worry. You'd better go clue Billy in. You don't want Jacob here when it happens. I jumped to my feet as I pulled my hand back, patting Jacob on the shoulder in a gesture that I hoped was reassuring. You just rest, Jake. I'll let your dad know that you're probably coming down with something. I turned and strode into the living room, my steps falling just a bit harder on the floor, as I did when I wanted someone to hear that I was coming. "Hey, Billy," I said when I peeked my head around the corner and smiled at him. "Jake's looking pretty bad. He's burning up. Maybe you should come check his temperature or something." I gave Billy a significant look when Charlie wouldn't notice. Then I turned and walked back to the kitchen. I heard Billy tell Charlie that he didn't think Jacob was very sick or they wouldn't have come. Jake was still face down on the table, arms curled around his math book, and he was covered in sweat. Billy rolled in behind me, taking one look at his son before rolling over and putting a hand to his head. "He's fine," Billy said, giving Edward a long, considering look. "He's not," I said, shifting forward to look long and hard at Billy. I leaned close enough to whisper to him, "You do not want him changing here in front of Charlie. Get him home, Billy. Charlie is safe from me, and you know it." Right now, I was less risk to Charlie than an unpredictable werewolf who was about to transform for the first time. If Jacob was going to destroy a house, I didn't want it to be mine. It was imperative to both me and them that Charlie remained in the dark. Billy returned my steady look for a long moment before he reached over to pat his son on the shoulder. He turned and wheeled toward the door before he spoke again. "Come on, Jacob. Let's get you home. You'll be more comfortable resting there," Billy said before he left the room to explain to Charlie that they were leaving. "Sorry, Bells." Jacob tilted his head off the book and looked at me. "I hate to bail on you, but I really feel horrible. I should probably be home." It was cute, but I was the last person he owed excuses or apologies. I watched as he drew himself to his feet, manifesting to my perfect eyes the inches he'd grown in the last couple of weeks. "Don't worry about it, Jacob. Go home and get feeling better." I smiled and leaned over to hug him. Edward stiffened and braced himself probably to drag me out of Jacob's arms if he shifted suddenly. "And Jake, I want you to know that, no matter what happens, you're always welcome here. I want to still be your friend." This last was said almost too softly for Jacob to hear, and Edward gave me a sharp look. I ignored it as I guided Jacob gently out of the kitchen and toward the front door. Charlie was helping Billy roll his wheelchair down the front stairs to the car they'd borrowed. I would have offered to drive them home, but I wasn't allowed on the reservation. Instead, I stood by the front door while Charlie settled both of them into the car. Edward came to stand beside me, wrapping an arm around my waist, and I leaned into him. "You're having a hard time with this, aren't you?" he said softly into my ear, as I watched Jacob fold himself into the driver's seat and then say goodbye to Charlie. "Yeah," I admitted, looking up at him. "I'm afraid he won't want to hang around anymore once he's changed. He'll hate me then." I looked back as they started to pull away, and Edward took a step back as Charlie waved to the retreating car. It would not be good if Charlie noticed we were too familiar already. "I don't think anyone could seriously hate you, Bella," he said gently before we walked back into the kitchen, letting Charlie close the front door. I laid my biology notes on the table next to Edward's, making it look as though we were studying for the test, just as we'd told Charlie. I dropped into the chair and just shrugged, looking up at Edward as he sat next to me. "Werewolves hate vampires, Edward." My response was far too soft for Charlie to hear, and my eyes met his. Edward reached over to close my hand in his, placing a gentlemanly kiss on the back of it before he reluctantly released me. He turned his attention immediately to the biology book, just as Charlie came into the room on the pretense of getting another beer. "Refreshment obtained." Charlie leaned against the countertop. He stood there watching as we organized our notes before starting to go over the review questions. Edward did his best to ignore my father, but he knew exactly what my old man was thinking. I finally looked up at him, leaning there drinking his beer, and I gave him an irritated look. "Dad, do you have to hover?" I finally blurted out, leaning back in my chair. He wasn't usually the hovering type. In fact, he'd never done it with me before. It was something I had appreciated about him previously. Charlie tried to look innocent, but there was too much protective father in his face for me to believe it. "I can't get any studying done if you're going to stand there glowering," I pointed out to him and then got up to gently push him out of the room. "Besides, you're missing the game." That was enough to get my overprotective dad moving. Edward looked up at me, amused, as I literally pushed Charlie from the room. He was entertained by Charlie's reaction. He tried his best to hide it from me, but I knew him too well for that. After a minute, I returned. My father settled safely in the other room, but where he could still hear the usual noises from the kitchen. I dropped into my chair once again and frowned at Edward before I looked at the next review question. It was unneeded, this focus on homework, but it made Charlie feel like everything was normal. Besides, Now study time was time with Edward, which was always a good thing. As the next few days passed, I tried not to think at all about Jacob and what he must be going through. I could imagine that I did understand the shock that Jacob must be experiencing. He couldn't be happy about everyone keeping him in the dark for so long. Part of me hoped that he didn't hate me once he had shifted, but I didn't hold out hope for the miracle that he might still want to be friends. I knew Edward noticed when I worried about Jacob. It made him upset to see me sad, so I tried to hide how I was feeling to keep that stricken look from his eyes. Spring was slowly coming to the moist Olympic Peninsula, and that meant lots of rain. Storms came on and off, but it was mostly rain without the additional fireworks of thunder and lightning. One evening, Alice showed up while Edward and I were lounging quietly on the couch in his room, reading poetry aloud to each other. "There's going to be one heck of a storm tonight," she said as she thrust her head into the doorway, Jasper appearing behind her. A slow smile spread across Edward's face, and he glanced from Jasper to Alice. I could see him focus on the expectant look on Jasper's face before he nodded. "You bet so long as Bella wants to come along," he answered. Their unspoken question, and I looked up at him in confusion. "Remember when I told you that we played baseball on stormy nights in the large clearing we showed you the night of the treaty meeting?" The anticipation in Edward's eyes was tempting. "You want to play baseball tonight, Alice?" I turned my attention to the pair in the doorway, and they beamed at me, nodding. "I don't really know how to play, but I'll go and watch if you like." I turned to look at Edward, and his subsequent smile was delighted. I started to wonder how many things he hid his interest in just because he thought it wouldn't appeal to me. "Yay," Alice squealed, clapping her hands together and hopping up and down on her toes. "The first claps of thunder will start at 6:43 tonight." She turned on her heel and hopped on Jasper's back like an overenthusiastic little monkey. He grinned up at her, and then they both left, darting out of the room with a speed that I would have missed had I been human. They had such a cute relationship that it made me smile. But I wasn't jealous. I loved what I had with Edward. Thinking of Edward, my attention returned to him as I set down the book I had been reading from. He was still smiling at me, joyfully. He probably thought I was humoring him, but he was wrong. I really wanted to see their version of baseball. Vampire baseball. "I guess we're playing baseball." I leaned over and dropped a kiss on his nose, smiling as he wrinkled it up, and then dragged me onto his lap for a snuggle. "We should stop at the house first and let Charlie know we're going out, in case I'm home late. Besides, he likes it when I let him be the involved father." Edward nodded once and then lifted me up into his arms. He didn't let me go as he stood, walked out of the room and down the hall toward the stairs. I squealed and wriggled when he didn't let me down, trying to get free. He must not have been ready to let me go quite yet because he completely ignored my wriggles and protests. He was in a great mood, deliriously happy to share this with me. "Edward, put me down. I can walk, you know," I protested again, wriggling to encourage him to put me down. "I know, but I like to carry you." He smiled back at me, but at the bottom of the stairs, finally set me back on my feet. I grinned back at him and then looked around in surprise at the way the house was in a sudden uproar. The main level of the house was in a flurry of activity. Rosie was trying to find her baseball outfit, but couldn't because Alice had stolen it. The interfering elf had stolen it because she had designed a new one and wouldn't let Rosalie wear the old one. Emmett couldn't find the bat he preferred because Jasper had hidden it after their last game. Edward explained that this was in retaliation for a dirty trick Emmett played on Alice during that game. Esme was dressed and ready, an oasis of calm amongst the storm. She was in the process of lowering a baseball cap over her thick caramel-colored hair with a broad smile on her lips. I let go of Edward long enough to walk over and give her a hug, and then returned so we could head back to Charlie's. "Hurry back," Esme called out as we headed out the front door. "The storm isn't going to last nearly long enough." I was amused by her reminder. It looked like the entire Cullen family enjoyed playing baseball together. I wondered if my new abilities would allow me to play without embarrassing myself. Would I be just as much of a klutz as I had been, or would I slide right into it with vampiric grace? I hoped it would be the latter rather than the former, but some part of me still expected that I'd be horrible at all things physical. The way Edward drove, it didn't take long to get back to Charlie's, and I slammed into the house with loud abandon as I tended to do when Charlie was home. My actions weren't violent compared to how a human moved, but louder and more noisier than a vampire. "Hey, Dad, I might be out late tonight." I stuck my head around the corner into the living room where he sat watching TV. "I'm going to play baseball with Edward's family." I left Edward walking into the room as I turned and ran upstairs to change. As I started to get ready, I heard Charlie rise from his chair to greet Edward. He often did things like that as though it was uncomfortable for him to be at a disadvantage when Edward was in the room. "You're really getting her to play baseball," I heard my father ask with the sound of skepticism ripe in his voice. "It seems so, sir." Charlie still refused to allow Edward to address him less formally. He insisted on keeping distance between them, even when he insisted everyone else call him Charlie. "Well, there might be hope for you yet," Charlie admitted hesitantly. I knew him well enough to follow his thinking. If Edward could get me to be involved with sports, Charlie could find something redeemable about our relationship. I listened at the door while they talked about the upcoming spring season for the Mariners, and I laughed softly at the enthusiasm Charlie was putting into the discussion. Edward seemed just as interested. I wondered if baseball was one of those things that they could share, even if it wasn't something I was all that interested in. "Hurry up and rescue me from your father, Bella," Edward admonished in a low voice no human could hear, prompting me to giggle in response. He knew I'd been spying on them. We were getting short on time, though, so I turned to throw on some comfortable clothes that I didn't mind covering in mud. I was dressed and ready too quickly even after my spying, but I figured that Charlie would just chalk it up to excitement of going out with my boyfriend. I headed down the stairs at a slow pace that I thought would look fast and excited for a human. I deliberately tripped on the last step. Edward, figuring something like this was coming, was right there to catch me. I'd taken to tripping at random times and not always when there were humans watching. It had become a game between us to see if Edward could keep up with klutzy Bella. I never hit the pavement, my own reflex is too good for that, but he didn't always catch me either. I was always delighted when he missed, and enjoyed teasing him about it. I loved when he caught me too. He would wrap me up in his arms and hug me tightly. Tonight, with Charlie watching, he just gently steadied me and then took a step back. Charlie watched my antics with an amused look, shaking his head as he sipped at his beer. "You're getting pretty good at anticipating her," Charlie observed, appreciating another thing about Edward tonight. Charlie had noticed that Edward never let me fall if he could stop it, but often caught me when he couldn't. "She's nearly always pitching into the floor head first, sir," Edward acknowledged. I did try to keep him on his toes. "It's just a matter of always expecting it." "Humph," my father responded with grudging approval, and then he turned to go back to his chair and his game. "Just keep her safe while you're playing baseball. With her luck, the ball would hit her right in the face." My father knew me too well. That is exactly what would have happened when I was human. I smirked at Edward as he helped me back into the bulky parka that Charlie would expect me to wear. He's right, I would get hit right in the face. A short time later, we were back in Edward's car and on our way back to the Cullen house before running directly to the clearing. The rest of the Cullens were already there, waiting for the storm to get noisy. The moment of truth would be when the thunder would kick in to mask the sound of their playing, according to Edward. When we got there, Esme came forward to meet us as we strode into the meadow. I grinned and hugged her tightly. She was always so sweet and affectionate. I was more than willing to give her as many hugs as she wanted. "We're on time," I pointed out to her with a smile. "The noise hasn't started yet." Esme laughed as I reminded her of her earlier admonition. She then gestured me to join her at home plate, and as I did, I noticed Carlisle out in the field marking the rest of the bases. They were placed much farther apart than in any regulation game, and I could guess the mess it would make if vampires tried to stay within the human confines of the basic game. It would be a challenge not to run into each other constantly. "I thought that you would play umpire if you didn't mind." "Bella," Esme said as she drew me gently away from Edward. He grinned at me before he ran to the pitcher's mound to greet Alice. Esme and I stopped at the home plate, and I looked at the pile of bats to the side. They were all steel bats, not a wooden one to be found. It shouldn't have surprised me. Wooden bats would not survive long with the impacts this group was likely to dish out. Carlisle finished the bases and returned into the infield with a broad smile. "Is everyone ready?" he asked as the rest of the family started to take their places. Esme then turned to look at me as she crouched down, as the catcher. There were no mitts either. They wouldn't need them with rock-hard vampire skin. "Now don't let them get away with anything, Bella," she admonished me. "They're terrible cheaters." I grinned back at her in response. I wouldn't be at all surprised at the cheating this group could come up with. Emmett would want to win at any cost, and Jasper would always be trying to make sure that Emmett didn't get away with too much. "Of course," I crouched behind Esme, leaning forward as Rosie stepped up to bat. I wouldn't imagine this group walks on a ball very often. I observed Riley as I watched Rosalie swing her bat. "Oh no, Bella, there is no walking in this game. If you don't hit the ball, it's a strike." Her eyes were twinkling at me as she answered. Rosie airily stepped into the area beside the base and waited. Alice, who was on the pitcher's mound, looked up at the sky. Just as the lightning struck, she threw her body into the wind-up, and the ball went flying toward Esme. Rose struck the ball hard, and the crack resounded just as the thunder struck. She took off toward first base. I waited and watched. I knew how Edward ran. I had tested him myself, and he took off after Rosie's ball as she rounded the bases. My eyes focused on the trees where the ball and Edward had disappeared. Edward went flying into the air, leapfrogging off a tree as he caught the ball and started running toward us again. He was laughing in delight, and I threw my head back, giggling as I called the play. "Out!" Rosie glared at me as Jasper stepped up to take his turn at bat. Rose was still openly hostile, and I wondered if that would ever change. Jasper stepped up to the plate, his lithe body ready for the ball, and smiled at his wife as she started the wind-up, laughing as he tried to anticipate her. A fraction of a second later, the ball went flying again. Jasper was able to hit it even harder than Rosia, popping it into the air as both Edward and Emmett went for the catch at the same time. They collided instead of catching the ball, and it hit a tree and rebounded back toward the field. The ball went flying, and Jasper headed for first base as Edward caught up the ball and threw it to Carlisle in the infield. They weren't fast enough, however, and Jasper was able to make it to second base. The game continued, fast and hard. Everyone seemed to be having a good time. Even me. I didn't play, getting a feel for the game, and happy to be the umpire of the day. I thought that I'd be right there in the thick of it during the next storm. I could play this game. As each person took their turn at bat, the positions in the field would rotate, giving everyone a turn to hit the ball. Edward's turn came up before long, and as he lifted the bat ready to hit the ball, Alice stopped cold, her eyes unfocused as she became completely engrossed in the vision that she was seeing. Edward froze in front of me, his own focus on Alice's vision as it played out in her head. "What is it?" I asked him as I stepped forward, adjusting the hat. Emmett had slammed down on my head when it was his turn at bat. Ismee stepped closer to us, a concerned look on her face as she waited for the answer. "I'm sorry," Alice said softly, directing her eyes on Edward. "I didn't see it. They weren't coming here till they heard us playing." Edward just shook his head, acknowledging that Alice couldn't anticipate everything. "What's up, Edward?" I finally demanded as the entire family came out of the field to gather around. "A coven of vampires. 3. Edward turned to look at me. "One is dark-skinned with braided hair, another is a red-haired female, and the third is a blonde man." Edward was watching me carefully, his eyes filled with worry. "From your description, it is likely the two you met in Phoenix, and they have picked up another companion, Bella," he warned me. I froze, staring back at him. "Here? Did they come here to find me?" I had worried about that since my attack, that my mom or dad or Phil could be in danger from what had happened to me, or those who'd done it to me. "I don't know, Bella. From Alice's vision, it seems they'll recognize you." Edward pulled me close to him and wrapped his arms around me after dropping the baseball bat to the ground. "Can you run?" Carlisle asked as he wrapped an arm around Esme. "Alice?" Edward turned to look at his sister as she watched the coming vision, as Edward made the decision to run, and she gasped in horror at the options that played out. "What if we meet them here? They'll go after Charlie if we run. That's who they're actually hunting now," he said quietly. "He can't find you by his usual ways, so he's going after Charlie to draw you in. If we leave, we can't save him. If we stay, we'll have other options. They must have made a stop at your school down in Phoenix or something. Bella, they know just where to find him. Then we do what we have to in order to protect Charlie," I said, resolved as I looked up at Edward. He nodded at the look on my face and lifted his head to look up and around at his family, meeting the eyes of each one until he reached Carlisle. "Carlisle, how do you want this to play out?" Edward asked him quickly and quietly. "They'll be in hearing range shortly." "We'll try to talk first," Carlisle said. "She's not alone and helpless here like she was in Phoenix." Carlisle's eyes met mine, and I could see the resolve in him as well. "We won't let them hurt you or your family, Bella," Carlisle promised me with a small smile and then gestured to the rest of the family. We could hear their footfalls now as they ran toward the clearing, and Carlisle took his place at the front, the rest of the family fanning out, leaving Edward and me at the back. Edward stood right beside me, close enough to give me some comfort, though I knew he was absolutely ready to defend me should it be necessary. He seemed to have faith in Carlisle's negotiation skills, and considering how often Jasper messed with me when I needed it, I knew he wouldn't be shy about controlling the moods of everyone involved in this kind of situation. I knew how hard it was to try to avoid Jasper's influence, especially if you weren't aware what he was doing. Alice reached back to touch my arm gently in reassurance as the trio neared the last of the trees that ringed the meadow and then ran into the open space before us. As they saw what a large group we were, they slowed, approaching at a less aggressive pace. My eyes, bright crimson now and clear of the obstruction of the contacts, were able to see everything in the clarity of vampire vision. I saw for the first time the true image of the man who attacked me. He really wasn't as attractive as I remember thinking he had been. He certainly didn't compare in any way to Edward. There was no way to measure up. His hair was a dirty blonde, a color that women all over the world paid millions of dollars to hide. His eyes were the deep burgundy of a vampire who lived on human blood but was getting hungry, and his features were entirely unremarkable for a vampire. The woman was the same one I remembered, and she was nearly as beautiful as I remembered her being. She was all that he was not, skin of alabaster smoothness with features of absolute refinement. Her hair was a halo of bright flame about her head. Their companion was by far the most striking of the trio. The darker sheen of his skin revealed that he had been quite dark in his human life. His hair draped in tiny, long braids down to the middle of his back. His clothes were ratty and worn, a stark contrast to the near perfection of his features and his creamy skin. The third man was the first to approach. He was almost hesitant in his movements, as though he was afraid of provoking so large a coven. "Hello," the darker one greeted. The other two remaining in the back as they assessed us as a group. "I am Laurent, and my companions are James and Victoria." As Laurent gestured behind him, my eyes followed and narrowed in on James. I finally had a name for the man who had caused so much havoc in my life. Now, we only had to find out just how much more he intended to create. I didn't want him hurting my family, either of them. Carlisle stepped forward at the introductions and proceeded to introduce us in pairs. "This is my family," the Cullen patriarch began as he gestured with his hand. "My wife Esme, and then our children Emmett and Rosioli, Jasper and Alice and Edward and Bella." I knew the moment that James noticed me. I was waiting for it. My eyes met his and I could see the recognition dawn. He had not known that I was going to be there. I hoped that it threw him off balance, swinging the odds favorably in our direction. Edward stiffened and stepped forward slightly away from me. My attention returned to him quickly. He was glaring back at James, teeth bared and body stiff with anger. I glanced back to the new vampires. James's attention had shifted from me to Edward and then the rest of the group. I could see the knowledge hit him that if he wanted me right now, he was going to have to fight his way through a strong and large coven to get me. Laurent seemed oblivious to the byplay for the first little while, continuing his discussion with Carlisle almost pleasantly. "You live here in a permanent residence?" Laurent was asking Carlisle, as my attention returned to their discussion. "Yes," Carlisle confirmed. "We ask that you do not hunt in the area. It would be most awkward for us, should you do so." "Of course not," Laurent agreed readily, and I saw James and Victoria snap their heads toward him in obvious surprise. "We heard the game and thought we would come and join you since we were in the area." That explained why Alice didn't see them. They had just made the decision to come this way. I was grateful for that. It meant that they had been distracted from finding my father. "We were just finishing with our game. I am sorry that you missed it," Carlisle was saying now, responding to Edward's slight shake of the head. There would not be peace between our groups. James wasn't interested in talking this out. James and Victoria took a step back, and then turned and ran off the way they had come, with no word or warning. They didn't hesitate at all about leaving Laurent to the mercy of a large and unknown coven. "If you would like, you can accompany us to our home, and we can discuss how it is we keep a permanent residence," Carlisle offered politely to the sole remaining vampire after he watched his companions leave without him. Laurent nodded politely at the offer as Carlisle tilted his head in our direction. "Emmett, Alice, why don't you go with Edward and Bella?" he suggested blithely, as though he weren't assigning a protection detail. We all knew that was exactly what it was. My mind was full with all the implications of these new events. I was in danger again, more I thought, than I had been before. Before, it had just been me they'd been after. Now, from what Edward said, they planned in bringing Charlie into it, that I couldn't allow. I had worked desperately to protect my father from the world of the supernatural, and I wasn't about to let James and Victoria mess that up. Most important, though, I wasn't alone. Edward was with me, and I knew he'd go to impossible lengths to protect me and my family. As bad as things were, I savored that knowledge with a flicker of elation. I would never be alone again.